The farm at the edge of the forest. In the quiet countryside, nestled between rolling hills and a dense ancient forest, there stood an old, weather-beaten farm. The locals called it the farm at the edge of the forest, but nobody talked much about it. Strange things had always happened there, whispers of disappearances, eerie sounds, and shapes moving through the trees. But it had been abandoned for years, until one cold autumn evening when Mark and Emily, a couple looking for a fresh start, bought the property. The realtor never mentioned the stories. She smiled politely as she handed over the keys and wished them well, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of unease. Mark brushed it off, eager to start a new life away from the city, and Emily followed, reassured by his confidence. The first few days were peaceful, even picturesque. The forest loomed tall and dark at the edge of their land, but they paid it no mind. Instead, they focused on fixing up the old farmhouse, painting the walls, and planting a garden. At night, however, strange noises began to creep into the air, soft rustling like something or someone moving through the trees. On the fourth night, the sound came closer. Mark woke to a scratching at the window. He looked out, expecting to see a branch brushing against the glass, but instead he saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. It was too far to make out clearly, just a dark silhouette among the trees. Mark shook it off, assuming it was his imagination, and went back to sleep. But the next morning, Emily found something strange. In the dirt around their house were large footprints, bigger than any human or animal they'd ever seen. They led from the forest to the farmhouse, but vanished before reaching the front door. "Maybe someone's playing a prank," Mark said, but Emily wasn't so sure. The following night, the scratching returned, louder this time. Mark grabbed a flashlight and went outside. As he approached the forest, the beam of light caught something moving. A tall, hunched figure darted between the trees. His heart pounded as he followed, but the deeper he went into the woods, the more lost he became. The trees seemed to twist and turn around him, the air growing colder and heavier with every step. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. The dark pressed in from all sides, and the silence was broken by soft whispers, unintelligible but insistent. Mark turned to run, but something grabbed him, cold, sharp fingers around his wrist. He screamed and wrenched himself free, stumbling back toward the house. When he finally burst through the door, he found Emily waiting for him, pale and terrified. She had been standing at the window, watching him. "Mark, there was something following you," she whispered. That night, they barricaded themselves inside, but the scratching persisted. It moved from window to window, and by dawn, they both knew they had to leave. They packed their things quickly, throwing clothes and essentials into bags. But as they loaded the car, the forest seemed to come alive. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches twisting unnaturally toward the house. And there, just beyond the tree line, were figures, dozens of them. Dark, twisted shapes with hollow eyes, watching, waiting. "We have to go now," Emily cried, but the car wouldn't start. Mark turned the key frantically, the engine sputtering and coughing, but refusing to come to life. The figures moved closer, creeping out of the forest and across the field, their eyes glowing faintly in the early morning light. In a panic, they ran back into the house, slamming the door behind them. But the figures didn't stop. They reached the farmhouse, their cold hands pressing against the windows, scratching, scraping. The last thing Emily saw before the glass shattered was a face, pale, gaunt, with eyes that glowed like embers. And then the darkness consumed them both. The farm remains abandoned to this day. The locals still avoid it, whispering about the couple who disappeared, just like so many before them. And at night, if you stand at the edge of the forest, you can still hear the scratching, the forest calling for more. The night at Blackwood Farm. It was a late summer evening when the Harris family settled into their new life on Blackwood Farm. The fields were golden with crops, and the towering barn stood proud against the horizon. But the land came with a warning. The previous owners had left abruptly, leaving everything behind. The townsfolk spoke of strange happenings, but Mr. Harris dismissed the rumors, eager for a fresh start with his family. Their children, Tommy, 12, and Lily, 9, were thrilled with the wide-open spaces and endless room to explore. They played from dawn until dusk, never worrying about the looming forest that bordered the farm or the eerie silence that fell after dark. One evening, their parents went into town, leaving Tommy and Lily alone. Mr. Harris promised they'd be back before sunset, but as the sky deepened into a dark, velvety blue, there was no sign of them. The wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the old farmhouse, and the children could hear the groaning creaks of the barn swaying with the breeze. "It's just the wind," Tommy assured Lily, though he felt uneasy himself. To distract themselves, they played hide-and-seek inside the house. But as Tommy searched for Lily, he heard a low, rhythmic knocking coming from outside. It wasn't the sound of the wind nor the barn. It was deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. "Lily," he called, suddenly worried. When there was no answer, he rushed to the window. What he saw made his heart stop. Standing just beyond the house, facing the barn, was a boy about his age. But this boy was wrong. His clothes were tattered, covered in dirt, and his skin was pale, almost gray. He stood unnaturally still, his head tilted down as though he was staring at something in his hands. "Lily, come here, quick," Tommy whispered, his voice trembling. Lily emerged from her hiding spot, sensing her brother's fear. She peeked out the window and gasped. "Who is that?" she whispered, grabbing Tommy's arm. "I don't know," Tommy said, stepping back. "We should—" The knocking grew louder, but this time it came from inside the barn. Knock, knock, knock. They both froze. The figure outside hadn't moved, but the sound now echoed from the barn. Slowly, its large doors began to creak open, revealing only darkness within. "Tommy," Lily whispered, her voice shaking, "I don't like this." He didn't either. But he felt a strange compulsion to look closer, as though the darkness itself was pulling him toward it. Hand in hand, the two crept to the back door and peered out at the barn. The knocking had stopped, but the doors remained slightly ajar. Just then, the boy outside turned his head toward them. His eyes were black pits, hollow and empty. He raised one hand, pointing toward the barn. "Don't go in there," a voice suddenly whispered behind them. They spun around, but no one was there. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Don't go in the barn." Lily clutched Tommy's hand tightly. "We need to leave." But as they stepped back toward the house, the barn doors swung open with a forceful bang. Inside, something moved. A tall, shadowy figure, barely distinguishable but unmistakably human-like. Its body twisted unnaturally as it stepped forward. "Run!" Tommy shouted. They bolted toward the house, slamming the door behind them. But the air grew thick, and a deep, guttural voice seemed to fill the room, vibrating through the walls. "They're coming," it growled. "They always come for the children." Suddenly, the windows rattled, and a loud thud shook the house. Tommy looked outside again, and the boy was gone. But the field was no longer empty. Dozens of figures now stood around the house. Children, all of them gray and lifeless like the boy, their dark eyes fixed on the farmhouse. Some clutched ragged toys, others held hands, and all of them began moving slowly, methodically, toward the front door. The barn door slammed shut in the distance, but the children didn't stop. They came closer, their faces blank, their hollow eyes locked on the terrified siblings. Lily whimpered as she backed away from the window. "Tommy, what do they want?" "I don't know," he whispered, pulling her close. "But we need to hide." They ran up the stairs to their room, barricading the door with a chair. The sound of small hands scratching at the front door echoed through the house, followed by soft, eerie voices calling their names. "Tommy! Lily!" The voices rose in a haunting chorus, louder and louder, until suddenly the front door creaked open with a soft click. The scratching stopped. Silence fell, thick and oppressive. Then slow, deliberate footsteps began climbing the stairs.
Thud, thud, thud. Tommy and Lily held their breath, huddled in the corner of the room. The door to their bedroom rattled, and then silence. The footsteps stopped outside their door. The children clung to each other, paralyzed with fear as the handle began to turn. When Mr. and Mrs. Harris returned later that night, they found the front door wide open and the house eerily silent. The lights flickered as they called for Tommy and Lily, but there was no response. Upstairs, the children's room was empty. The window was wide open, the curtains billowing in the breeze. Outside, in the moonlit field, stood two new figures, motionless, pale, and staring toward the barn. Their faces were hollow, and their dark eyes glowed faintly in the night. Tommy and Lily had joined the children of Blackwood Farm, and now they too were waiting.